Although the likelihood of a surprise Soviet attack on the United States is very remote, the growing possibility of such an attack being successful undermines our policy of deterrence and brings closer the risk of nuclear war. Our bomber and missile forces were designed and built in the 1950s and 60s to be secure against the threat from the relatively small and inaccurate Soviet missile force that existed at that time. Today, the United States is confronted by a Soviet missile force that is massive and highly accurate. It is now conceded that an attack on our Minuteman missiles would result in the destruction of 90% of that force. The consequences of this development are grave and far-reaching.
We always did expect to be in this position if we didn't modernize our forces. We didn't expect to be this soon, and we expected to have modernized our forces faster than we did.
Some 15 years ago, the United States decided to exercise a policy of self-restraint in our strategic force programs, hoping that we would induce reciprocal self-restraint on the part of the Soviet Union. And from that, strategic arms limitations would be reached. The idea then was that the more we did in our strategic forces, the more we'd force the other side to do, whereas the less we did, then the less they would have to do. Now, in pursuing this policy of self-restraint, we forgot the second half of the proposition, and that was the minimum we must do is assure always that our forces are thoroughly survivable against any scenario of, to use Harold Brown's words, even a well-executed surprise attack.
The Soviets, in contrast to the United States, over the last 15 years have been serious about defense. They have been deadly serious about defense. At the moment, they are not only procuring more defense hardware than the United States by 90 or 100%, they are outspending the entire free world in the area of military investment. And one must assume that they have some calculation and some motive for that behavior.
The Soviet Union now has the ability to deliver a nuclear warhead within 600 feet of a Minuteman silo. It is this accuracy, combined with the destructive power of the thousands of nuclear warheads in the Soviet arsenal, that has made our land-based missiles vulnerable.
A sound deterrent must be based upon the proposition that no major component of our deterrent forces is vulnerable. Otherwise, we've lost the ability to enforce stability in a crisis or at any other time. But the ICBM force is unique because it carries with it particular properties that are essential to carrying out a reasonable strategy of limited strikes against hard targets. It's the ICBM force, and only the ICBM force, that's capable of threatening Soviet time-urgent hardened targets. The submarine force isn't accurate enough, and the bomber force isn't rapid enough. Therefore, knowing this, the vulnerability in the ICBM force seems to me to be the most destabilizing possibility that we can face in the 1980s.
To design your land-based missile forces so that they are capable of withstanding a surprise attack from 4,000 or 5,000 Soviet ICBM warheads is a very substantial undertaking. And it takes a system of the scope and the complexity of the MX to do that. We've looked at dozens of alternative ways of doing it. We know of other ways of doing it, but they're all either more complex, more expensive than MX, or they are not technically feasible. They do not really provide the reduction in vulnerability.
The MX missile is to depend for its survival on a multiple protective shelter basing system. Each missile would have 23 shelters, between which the missile would be periodically shuttled. Because of the uncertainty as to which shelter contained the missile, all 23 would have to be attacked to be sure of destroying one missile. Such an attack is considered too costly for the Soviets to undertake. While the controversy surrounding this system has mainly concerned its great cost and environmental impact, a more urgent consideration is how soon it could be available.
That system won't begin its deployment until 1986. It won't complete it until 1989. So during the 80s, we will not have the ability to withstand a surprise attack on our land-based missiles. And that is a problem, and that does increase the risk.
There is an interim solution that the U.S. has worked on for many years and has found technically feasible, and that is to take the existing Minuteman III missile, canisterize it, modify it so that it can be easily moved from one location to another, build many silos for each individual Minuteman III missile. This would require much greater resources on the Soviets' part to destroy the land-based missiles, and would certainly give a great deal of survivability to the land-based missile force. This could have been done by now, and could certainly be done by the mid-1980s with the Minuteman III missile, because the missile already exists and doesn't have to be developed from scratch.
There's fundamentally nothing wrong with expanding the Minuteman deployment, building several thousand more shelters in the Minuteman fields, and having a deceptive basing system with the Minuteman system. But it is an illusion to think that that would happen any quicker or any cheaper or be in any way superior to the MX program.
The latest estimates show that the MX system would cost $50 billion. Why is that? Only about a fifth of that will be the missile. The rest is the deployment scheme, the shelters, the transporters, the tracks, the roads, and so on. Why all that? Well, on the one hand, you want to have the missile hidden, concealed, so that the Russians do not know where it is, so they cannot target it, attack it with their missile warheads. On the other hand, because the government still thinks that there will be a SALT treaty in the future, and for the purposes of SALT, they want to have the missile to be seen and verifiable. That's why you have these complex shelters with sliding roofs that can be opened and closed and so on. You're trying to square a circle. You're trying to have a missile which is invisible, so that it will be safe, and visible, so that it can be counted for arms control. You try to do the two, and it costs you $50 billion.
If we look at any one system in isolation, including the MX, we can design ways of destroying that system. The way that we protect our deterrent is by having multiple systems, all of which have certain advantages as well as certain disadvantages, and the composite of those systems provides us with adequate deterrence. We are going to need the MX. One has questions about the particular mode of deployment, but it is far more important for the United States to redress the strategic arms balance than to indulge in a 5 or 10-year debate about the ideal mode of deployment.
America evolved a so-called triad of strategic forces after the Second World War: bombers, intercontinental ballistic missiles, and nuclear submarines which could launch missiles while safely submerged. It has been suggested that we abandon our vulnerable land-based missiles and rely on submarines and bombers only. This might be possible if it were not for inherent limitations and potential problems facing these forces.
The bomber force, in my view, is at least as vulnerable to a first strike as is the ICBM force. It's highly concentrated, the alert rates are very low, and Soviet advances in technological capability have put that force into jeopardy in the time frame every bit as much as the ICBM force.